good morning. Welcome to day 3 of ETS 2023. Hope you're having a great morning. I'm incredibly excited about this panel. Having a background in IoT, it's going to be great talking about edge devices and solutions. I have some wonderful panelists. I think we're going to have a lively discussion, which is great because this is the one before lunch, so please stick around. Joining us today, we have Carlos Nouel, the VP of Transformation Programs at National Grid. We have Mark Webb, the SVP and Chief Innovation Officer for Dominion Energy. Pat Hohl, Director of Electric Industry Solutions for Esri, and Mike Phillips, co-founder and CEO of Sense. So before we get into the technical discussion, we would really like to know from each of you what makes you passionate about the work that you do. Carlos, would you kick us off?
Sure. Good morning, everyone, I guess. I always tell this story, and I think I told it last year. I've been doing clean energy for a while, and, I started... I need to turn it on. Yeah, kind of a problem. So I started doing kind of clean energy sort of by accident. We were doing this pilot program in Worcester, Mass. On smart grid, and at the time I had no idea what smart grid was. And started doing it, and it was fantastic, and because it actually showed me that this technology can help customers like in a meaningful way. It can actually make a difference for them. But I think the thing that crystallized it for me, it's a bit more of a personal story. So I have 2 kids, and at the time I was running the EV part of National Grid, and I was testing a bunch of EVs. Brought one home, and my son was like, "Wow, this is a really cool car. Like, can you actually make sure that every single car in the future it's an electric vehicle?" And I'm like, "Well, that's a tall order. I don't know if I can do that, but I can probably make a difference in actually making that happen." So for me, it's become a bit of a personal passion of trying to get to this future, which I think kids are probably more interested than I was when I was their age. They see the value, they see the need, and that's encouraging. So that's part of the reason why I do what I do.
Awesome, thank you so much. Mark?
Sure. Yeah, you do have to turn it on. We were falsely...
We got a bunch of technologists up on stage, guys.
There you go.
Oh, there we go. What energizes me, I think, is that every day I get to say why not as much as I want to in any meetings with the folks in business units, and people aren't used to hearing that. Everything is why we can do something or we can't do this, and I always will challenge why not. Because part of innovation is to look at the hurdles, the obstacles. Some are technology, and maybe that you really can't do something. Some are legislative, some are policy, and some may be in the future. And so the question why not leads to, well, how? And how do we do that? And what's the path to get there? And it just changes the way people think. So I think that's what I enjoy most about what I do.
That's really great. That's sort of an improv mindset. I think Venus from the, Inclusion Institute was mentioning that the other day. It's a yes and mentality, which I think is awesome. Thank you so much. Pat?
Really good, Mark. Thank you. I appreciate that. I would say what energizes me are possibilities. Tony Robbins, years ago, he used to talk about people's motivation, and he would put it on a spectrum between necessity and possibility. Let me give you an example. I would say to my son, "Why don't you put the trash out?" And you know what he would say? He would always ask me the same question. He would say, "Do I have to?" Yes, you do. And when it became a necessity, it made sense to him. And he responded to that, and he would put the trash out. In contrast, I saw that tomorrow's trash day, we're done with dinner, it's still light out. This is a good time to do it. It's a great possibility. Let's do that. And utilities today are faced both with a necessity to change, but also some great possibilities on the horizon. So if you want to dream with me about what's possible, I'm all in.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Mike?
Yeah, I can give you a little bit of my personal journey because I've been in the consumer-facing tech world for a long time, previously in voice recognition. So those voice assistants you talked to, we did one of the very earliest ones. We were actually a couple of years ahead of Siri. First version of Siri you had to type to. Ours you could talk to. We connected the two up. Steve Jobs saw it, bought Siri, and then we were the voice interface for others. And we went through this transition between phones were just phones, and then they became these platforms for all these different applications. So I had this realization that we work so hard, and so what? People can talk to their phones. And then let's take the stuff we know and take all of our energy and work and venture capital money and spend it on something that matters more. We care a lot about this climate problem that's happening and the energy transition that has to happen. And the parallels between the transformation that telecom went through, where a phone was just a phone and then it became these applications, can happen here also. We see the same thing in the energy world. How do we make the energy infrastructure smart in a way to drive consumer outcomes and behavior? We'll talk more about that later, but it's so exciting for me to be working in this industry. It's not fast, but it's so much more important to do this stuff at scale in an important way.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I definitely think we're going to get to touch on some of these things today, which is really exciting. So we know that the nature of the grid is shifting. How do you think the grid will fundamentally change over the next decade, Mark?
Well, I was thinking about this, and there used to be an old adage that people would say, about 10 years ago, that if Thomas Edison came back, he would recognize the grid that he developed in the early 1900s, and that was probably true. It's not true. It hasn't been true for the transmission grid probably since 2005, when we began to make substantial improvements in the transmission grid and technology. And I think in 10 years, I view the next 10 years as sort of the golden age for the distribution grid, in terms of what's going to come and what's going to be needed in terms of intelligence and software and distributed resources and what has to happen in resiliency. So in 10 years, Thomas Edison may come back, and he's going to say, WTF. He won't recognize it. He may recognize the poles and the wires. He may not. They may be underground. A much larger portion will be. But it's going to become a very different grid that will a distribution grid in particular, I think, as we've sort of merged the flow of electrons with the flow of technology and communications. Because I do think that there's sort of they will be intertwined in the way that we manage the entire grid, but in particular, I think the distribution grid will change more over the next decade than it has in the last 60.
Excellent, thank you. Pat?
So just to springboard off of what you said, Mark, when I was an engineering student in the 80s, my professor started off and he said, nothing has changed in electrical engineering since the 30s. And that stunned me as a student. I thought, really? Is that right? And then I went to work for the utility and I worked my first storm and people were calling in on the phone and I was equally shocked. I said, you mean we don't know that they're out of power? So I think it's important to realize when you look at this question that we're starting from a relatively low level of sophistication as a system. And we love our circuits, do we not? In distribution, we love our circuits. We do everything by circuit. We feed all of the load, we patrol, we switch, we inspect, cut trees, we do everything by circuit. But a circuit is a very big hunk of the system. And in order to respond to all of the exploding possible operating conditions that we'll face, those pieces are going to have to be much smaller. And not only will they have to be smaller and more configurable, but they're going to have to change much more rapidly than we're used to. And that's going to introduce some safety concerns for workers. Instead of switching a circuit once or twice a year, it may change a couple times a second in the way that it feeds. And of course, it will contain many more sophisticated devices, and it will be connected to more sophisticated devices. So that means that rather than running on manual operation, most of this is going to have to be driven by data and software in a much more automated way.
Excellent, thank you. Mike?
So if you excuse me for getting into the weeds here for a moment, look, I've been spending a lot of time at conferences like this. We hear a lot about distributed intelligence, grid edge. I've been hearing this for years and years, but we are like deeply in the how to make that happen. And here's why I want to get in the weeds. And I'm sorry, this maybe sounds a little bit boring, but there's a thing that you all have control over, which is these meters that are in the home, right? I mean, that really is the edge of what the utility industry controls, is these meters that are attached to the outside of people's homes. And I've been out there saying we got to get real about making those meters sufficiently capable to have high resolution data, have upgradable edge computing, have better networking. We know how to do that, and that then becomes the platform on which all of us can now innovate at this edge. And that's, to me, what's been missing is the gap between the words that we're all talking about. I think we all know what we need to do, and the how do we actually make it happen. And my appeal is we know how to make it happen. We need this industry to get the right infrastructure in place, just like back to my previous thing, telecom, when we had the right kinds of phones finally, it transformed the telecom industry. By having intelligence applications software at the edge, we haven't had the ability to do that in this industry until recently, and we can now.
Excellent. Thank you. Carlos.
Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what everyone said, but I would say for me the biggest shift that I see is the change in responsibility that we're going to have as an industry, right? Traditionally, we've been responsible for powering houses and businesses and make sure that they can have electricity and in many cases gas to do the things that they do every single day. And while that will continue to be the case, we're now going to venture into becoming the service provider for transportation. Right, and I think about like one of the things that keeps me up at night is when there's a big storm in the Northeast, right? Before the biggest thing is like you need to make sure that people get power back. But they had the option that they could take their cars, go to a hotel in a different area, and stay overnight. Right? That is going to change because in the future we're going to be powering transportation. So that only means that we're not just powering that house. We're also powering the transportation so they can actually get out of the house in case of an emergency. And that's a big responsibility. The other piece for us is we're going to be responsible for heat. We are a dual fuel commodity company, right? So we provide gas and electricity. So we, to some degree, have been responsible for the gas and heating in homes. But as we think about electrification of heat, that's going to be a big shift, right? In places like Massachusetts or New York where it gets really, really cold, you're going to ensure that that same grid that you've used for 100 years, as you said, it's now going to have a lot of other purposes, and you're going to have a lot more responsibility from what you had before. And I think that, we talk, as Mike was saying, we talk a lot about grid edge. We talk about DERs. Now it's real. Like when you get into this world where you're powering transportation and people cannot leave their houses because they cannot charge their electric vehicle, that's a bigger issue. So, I mean, this shift in responsibility, I think it's something we all should take seriously, but it's also probably a trigger for us to say, let's stop talking and actually let's start doing.
Thank you so much for that and all of your perspectives. And Mike, you did jump ahead a little bit. That's okay. I won't hold it against you. No, but you're right. The responsibility is definitely shifting, and it really makes you think. I mean, we all know that it's beyond the technology, and it's really about the people. But for the people who have to serve the people, adding more responsibility to the mix just makes us all a little bit more stand up a little bit straighter and pay attention a little bit more. So thank you. So kind of building off of what Mike was talking about, right? If we're in the how to make it happen phase, how do utilities take advantage of what's available to them right now to drive resiliency and sustainability moving forward? Carlos?
Yeah, so not to steal Mike's thunder, so we do take his comments really seriously, and we are a super late adopter utility to AMI, and it's interesting, like AMI seems to be getting this bad rep that people have deployed AMI, and we had all these promises, and like not a lot has come through, but so when we were saying we need to deploy AMI, I'm like, I'm not going to deploy what everyone else is doing, because that actually feels like I'm putting something that has been in the market for 10 years, and this thing is going to be here for 20 years. So we really need to start pushing the envelope as we think about the products and the solutions we're putting in place, and not just think about what the problems we have today, but think about like stuff that I don't even know what's going to be in the future, but have that leap of faith that it's going to be necessary. So when we decided to kind of pick smart meters, we said we need to have things that Mike is talking about. And we essentially had to push the industry to say, we're not going to buy the same things that everyone else is selling. And I was called by multiple CEOs in this industry that I was crazy, that I didn't know what I was doing, and that no one would pay this much money for this new product that really no one wants. And I look back and kind of where we are today, and now this whole concept of grid edge computing, it's a reality, right? We're putting meters that have the ability to do grid edge computing. We have applications that run in the meter, right? And the reality is that shift, like going from this big monolithic things of like, I need to go and deploy like millions of dollars in investment, that's not gonna happen, and we need to find more efficient ways to do it. And I'll use one simple example. We were doing VVO, I would say probably 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? It was early on when no one was doing VVO. And that required us to make a ton of investments on our distribution feeders to have sensors and to have a bunch of things on the feeders that were required to actually do VVO. Where we are today is I can actually run VVO things on the meter. And I don't need all those devices anymore. So we actually need to start shifting that mentality of like, it's you don't need to invest in all those big things. You might need in some cases, but not every single time. You actually need to leverage the computing stuff at the edge to actually start doing that processing that before it was kind of impossible to be conceived. So I do think that, that is kind of that journey that we're kind of starting to get. But, it's not an easy one. It's an industry that's been running for 100 years, and because of that, there's pretty ingrained practices. And part of the role that, people like Mark and myself and others, and all of you in this room, is we need to start getting uncomfortable with, like, okay, I know that's not the way we've done it, but let's give it a try. Let's see how it goes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Pat?
When I think about grid edge things, I really think of it in two ways. One, we first think of pulling information in from the edge, and that's critical. Mike and I were talking last night, and as I reflected on that, the phrase that came to my mind was that's really the heartbeat of the grid. And if you want to manage the grid optimally, you really need to have your finger on the pulse of the heartbeat, and that's absolutely critical. But there's other grid edge things that happen. There's embedded image processing in drones and in devices that employees use to help perform recognition and speed workflows such as damage assessment or even routine inspection, right? We heard a lot about workforce yesterday. Somebody from PG&E told me a month or so ago that when they are able to hire a good employee, the first thing that happens when they walk in the door is they are deflated because they're working with 15-year-old everything. And those are the kind of devices, new devices that, a young person doesn't want to go inspect a piece of equipment and have to type every number that they see on a sticker, right? They want it to all just happen the way everything else in their life happens on their phone. So I see that there's all kinds of computing, and I love this idea. Carlos, kudos for thinking ahead and breaking outside the box, because there's a lot of people with very old meters out there, as we also heard this week, that are not capable of doing these kind of things that we're talking about. So we need to push forward. Once we bring all that information in, we really have to be able to push information back out to the edge for all of those other devices, like smart inverters that are able to provide services back to the grid in voltage support or VAR support or frequency support. But they have to know what to do. What do you need me to do right now, and what are you willing to pay me for it? That's the other half of the question. So the grid edge goes both ways in my mind. We pull a lot of information in, but we have to push information back out to employees that are sitting at the edge wondering how to make the best decision, and also out to devices that are at the edge.
Great. Thank you so much. Mike?
I just want to add one more thing to that model, which is, look, I think we still all have this mindset that meter's job is to collect data and send the data to someplace, and then that data gets analyzed and done for something. And you added one more part, which is to push data back again. I want to take it one step further, which is both of those are too limiting. What we really need is the fact that we can actually run software at the edge. I mean, this is what we're talking about when we talk about grid edge intelligence. We can't stick in the same model that meter's job is to make data or accept data. It's a little computer on the outside of everyone's home that this industry can control. So we got to start to think about it as this platform for software, not as a data collection device, because that's what's required to fulfill all the things we're talking about here. We just can't do that in the existing model of meters make data that goes someplace. We have to use it as a software platform for running things at the edge, not just sending data up.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point to make. These are not things that you just stick on and stick on a thing and turn it on, right? Like these are enablers, right? Enablement technologies. So that we have to change how we think about interacting with them moving forward. So thank you for that. Mark?
One, I think that we are adopting them. Maybe it probably needs to be faster, but change happens quickly. So there's a certain fear that you make the wrong choice or you make the wrong decision. So I think at its core, where you start is that people, the workforce, employees need to really begin to learn and appreciate the value of data and what it means, whether it's grid data, customer data, and then what you do with that data and how you can act on it and how it can improve reliability. I think one of the doors, at least for us and probably most utilities across the country, have really been opened to the value of that with the focus on cybersecurity. Every utility has had to do that, and in a big way. They beefed up probably to a very exponential increase in the size of their IT departments, and they understand the data and the role of these types of devices for providing security to the grid, both electronic and physical. But I think in terms of the use of data and doing that, I know we've had a program at our company where we have, through our IT department, we trained, we call them citizen data scientists. And these are people who kind of volunteer. They go through 6 months of training. They keep their other jobs, but they're taught about data and the value and what you can do with data. And then it means that every day in their jobs and their decision, when they're seeing something on that's happening in their workplace or on the grid or with customers, in the back of their mind, they're thinking, how can I bring this as a team to focus on what can we do with data to improve this? And so I think it's that the concept of kind of building within that people recognize that there is a need and there are tools out there. When you combine those two, I think it opens the door to being much more receptive to embracing some of the new technologies. And I would just add, the second one is you need to really bring regulators along and understanding that there may be a need to do small scale pilots to test out new technologies, and that speed, you don't want to make mistakes, but speed needs to be accelerated in the adoption of these things, and regulators, I think they will come along, but they need to be brought along probably and educated along the same journey that utilities are going through.
Excellent, thank you. Having citizen engagement with data, I think, is a really fascinating thing and changes the relationship with the community as well. So my brain is now like zinging in a bunch of different directions on that. Thank you. So I have one more question for the panelists before I open it up for questions. I want to leave lots of time before lunch, so please be thinking about it. We will call on you or we will give you a mic, so be prepared. But Mike sort of alluded to this earlier about what was missing from the conversation. So I'd really love to hear from you all what you think the gaps are in this discussion and what isn't being talked about enough. Pat, would you start us off?
Sure, I love this question. When I run a panel anytime in the future, I think I'm going to steal it, Joyce, because I really like this one.
You got it.
Yeah, it gives everybody an opportunity to just fill in the gaps from the conversation. So Esri makes the software that most utilities in this country use to help manage their infrastructure. We're thought of as a mapping company for those of you that don't have a familiarity with us. And the models that exist in GIS and the Geographic Information System capable of making those maps were developed in most cases about 20 years ago for the purpose of making maps. And what we're talking about today, the needs that we're looking at for the future, are much greater, much more detailed, and the models that it's going to take to support those kind of activities, DERMS, ADMS, SCADA with these complicated devices, smaller components of the system, smaller circuits, integrated microgrids. I think that's a part of the conversation that's missing. One of the things that makes Esri unique as a software company is that we spend about 1/3 of gross revenue in research and development. And in recent years, much of that development effort has gone into a new network model. And there are about 450 utilities worldwide that are in some process of adopting that new model. But I think that's the piece that's missing, because what happens is you look at your data quality and your model as it exists today, and most utilities, we did a survey a couple years ago, 77% of the utilities we surveyed reported that they had some significant concerns about the data quality of their model. So I would encourage people to think about that on a go-forward basis.
Thank you. And some of our research, which we alluded to earlier, we presented on earlier this week, actually says the same thing. And so it's definitely a challenge that we need to be thinking about addressing. Mark?
I'd say two things I thought of. One, I think, is we don't talk enough about transactional economics for customers. When we talk about some of the things that will be enabled, customers who can decide to respond into a program to have charge their cars at certain times, or potentially have their cars discharged, or other things like that, things that we do with sort of disaggregated data, is what's the what is the nominal payment to a customer? And is that going to be enough to cause them to act? Is it $5, $10? What will make a customer sit down and engage or risk a battery degradation or not having that car charged when they finally need to? At scale, it takes a lot to move customers that are from that inertia to do something. So I think from the utility side, we talk about it, but customers may have different views in terms of what will respond. And I think the other thing that I think generally has been alluded to on some other panels, but I think is the scale of the challenges ahead are simply just not talked about enough in terms of if you truly electrify 100% of transportation and then space heating and part of heavy industry. I mean, the numbers are mind-boggling in terms of what it means in new energy infrastructure and wires. I mean, just in our Dominion territory, our Virginia territory that we have, the latest PJM forecast, just on data center growth alone, we're going to have a 35 increase in generation requirements over the next 10 years. That's essentially almost all of the new renewables we're putting on, and we have a massive renewable bill with offshore wind and solar. So those challenges with the growth of data and high-speed computing, if we build electrolyzers for hydrogen in addition to transportation and space heating, the field for electrification is growing, in a multiples of 3-4 times over the next 30 years. And so what does that mean? I don't think people fully appreciate that we're doing all these things, but we're like George Jetson, potentially on the treadmill, where we're doing it and we're doing enough efficiency to keep up, but we have to do it all. But the challenge is enormous if we're going to get to those targets, whatever year you pick. The challenge of the scale of it is just massive and I think underappreciated.
Thank you for that. Absolutely. And I think being able to communicate with people about, very big, large, abstract things our brains can only handle so much. So unless you can make it really relevant and contextualize that for people and then bring them back into a bigger vision, it's probably not going to move forward as quickly as we need it to. So that's why storytelling and connecting with our community is so important to help drive, the messages that we needed to change. Carlos.
Yeah, so just picking on some of the points from Mark. I think for me, I'm probably one of those few individuals in the industry that have been on the control room side and the engineering side, but also on the customer side. And, one of the things I feel doesn't get talked about enough is that connection between those two sides of the organization, right? When you sit with a control room operator, they only see totals. They only see feeder getting overloaded or I need to move to a tab, whatever, right? And they think about total numbers and they don't think about what's behind it. Right? And then you have the people in the customer side saying, want to market this program, this EV program, we want to do this charging, and we want to have the batteries. But those two things rarely actually come together. And I feel that, as an industry, we actually need to start getting people in the control rooms to actually think about, what's actually in the feeder? I know that there's this much load, but what's the makeup of that load? Right? Is it EVs? Is it heating? Is it, something else? Because I think that's really, really important because those folks actually then need to understand what tools do they use, right? I've had this argument that, right now demand response, which is a really good solution, feels like a sledgehammer approach, right? When we call events, we call for everything. It doesn't matter what you have. You have batteries, you have EVs, you have pool pump, or you have a heating system. We call it all. And for now, that's probably okay. But in the future, if I have all those devices, I might not want to have my car, for example, be discharged. I might be okay with my pool pump, even though I don't have a pool, but as an example. And I think that's what becomes really, really important to understand what's actually happening in the system and actually what's going to happen. Because you can predict a lot, right? So if I know that right now it's a lot of EVs that are in my feeder, but I know usually those start to stop charging over the next hour, and it's HVAC that it's actually ramping up, I might leave the EVs alone and actually might say, am I actually going to focus on HVAC because those are the ones that are actually going to move the needle? So I think having that connection between the people that run the grid every single day and those that are on the customer side trying to sell and promote programs, actually that's really, really important. And I don't think that happens enough and that there's not enough conversations between those two sides. And that's going to be needed to get to the future.
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, so now it's your turn. I hope you've been thinking. So if we have any questions out there, please raise your hand so we can bring a mic to you. Oh my gosh.
You can see someone.
I think I can. Oh, yes, excellent. We've got one at the front. Hold on just a second, Hala.
Can you hear me? Okay. Halabaloo's Electric Power Engineers and NRI.ai actually work closely with Esri on the utility network model. I wanted to add on to the modeling aspect and the connection between the planning people who really are behind the design, the correct design of the future grid, and the data and the software. Each one of your perspective on the challenges that exist there today, because without planning for this future, the data can be used for today's operation, but we need it for a better grid of the future. So the disconnection that exists today between planning and amounts of data that are incredible and useful, your comments on that are appreciated.
Thank you.
Sure. So I would say probably National Grid, like most utilities that are in this room and in the US, we don't have clean data at all. So when we deployed, for example, ADMS, we had to do a massive cleanup effort just so we can actually run the algorithms that are really cool, but if you don't have good data, they spit out crappy results. And when we were doing that program, I'm like, this is a really inefficient way of going about this, because that means that we have to have engineers that go and verify it and get data, whatever, and there has to be a better way, right? And Mike and I were talking about and say, we're going to have this ability to disaggregate both on the customer side, but also look into the grid side. Can we start to actually find out how much data can we get from like just sensing the data, like sensing the grid, and start to update our GIS system that way, rather than having to do it manually? Can we use drones to actually start flying lines rather than having human beings? And I actually feel like we just need to get much better. Like, we're going to need the data without it, because our models for solving the grid, it's like they're depending on good data. We just need to find a much better way to solve that problem. I think there's one company here that was telling me about coding on putting stickers with barcodes on devices that have specific kind of protocols and values for that asset. We need smarter ways to get that data, because otherwise this complicated job becomes 10 times more complicated if you don't have the right data.
I mean, it's a good question, and I would just say there's a lot of room for improvement on the level of communication between planning and the folks in operations and elsewhere. I mean, we're a big company, like a lot of other ones, and like most big companies, there are a lot of silos. And it's always been, we kind of move between our units and with the innovation team, but we're always amazed to find that one team doesn't know that we're gathering a certain amount of data, or even talking to vendors that will provide data on another side. They're busy trying to develop an internal solution to try to locate data for one particular topic, and we say, well, over in distribution, they actually have an RFP out looking for this. And this is all within code of conduct. If there's, we do this correctly just for planning, if anyone's asking. But I mean, it's, and that's another hurdle. Some of those walls are because we err on the side. Utilities and energy companies have all these codes of conduct on information sharing that go up, and we overcorrect. People are afraid of doing anything wrong, so they kind of hold things close, even though they're using public data or data that would be available or that's not market sensitive data. So those are the kind of hurdles that need to be addressed, but we probably also need to address, maybe there's time to revisit some of the ways that you share data within utility systems to benefit the overall planning if we're going to get to the clean energy and meet the demands of the future.
Thank you so much. Pat?
Oh, that's a great question. As an industry, we have done an excellent job of providing safe, reliable, cost-effective service. But now we're being asked to do a lot more. The aspiration is very clear, but we haven't really, as an industry, gotten very deep into the detailed planning of how to pull that off. And I'll go one further, Hala. Then we have to build it. Then you have to operate it. And then you have to maintain it. And there are all of these other utility workflows that follow in the course of running a utility. And those are all of the things that have to be figured out. There is a tremendous amount of work to do. And Mark, I appreciate your point. If the amount of work we have to do is 3x what we've been doing, well, we're going to need a lot of good people.
Mike.
So, there is this new opportunity as we start to make this edge intelligence real and have like a lot more. I don't just mean a lot more data. I mean like many orders of magnitude more data and the ability to process it in the right way. And like one example I was talking to Pat about this morning is, I don't know if you remember, years ago we didn't have real-time traffic, and there was a national plans to put in smart highways, put sensors in the roadways and cameras on buildings and stuff to figure out real-time traffic. And the answer ended up being, once Google Maps was on most phones that are driving around in cars, the anonymized data feed from those phones is what gave us real-time traffic. That's why you get real-time traffic these days, is from this intelligence coming from the edge, data coming from the edge. The same can happen here. We can, since, as Carlos was mentioning, we can see both inside homes, subject to consumer privacy, absolutely important, see inside homes, see what the grid is doing in real time from the edge. We can now have a complete dynamic real-time picture of the entire grid and what we can do about it if we do the right things. And back to consumer privacy, super important. So don't let me forget that, but that's super important. But we have the ability to now have this very different view of the grid, not just the view, but then how do we manage it in real time, knowing that this transformer is starting to overload, and these 3 EVs are charging right now, and these customers respond to this message when that happens.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We have time for another question or two. Yes, we have a gentleman in the front.
Thank you. Brandon Rose with SMUD Board of Directors. I do a lot of transportation electrification work on the commercial side of things. And so we're talking about putting in multi-megawatts in the middle of cities. I have a project, it's 10 megawatts, a couple miles from the Port of LA and Long Beach to support 100 electrified trucks. And so I guess my question would be, are you doing, or how do you see the translation of transportation demand modeling into your edge of grid planning, which really will give you a sneak peek into, hey, where are we gonna have huge loads coming in the future?
Whoever.
I can. Go ahead. Go.
Well, I would say I think it's in its early stages, especially. I mean, we've looked a lot, at least my team had, and we've about what happens with if trucks electrify. I think it's still a question whether hydrogen will play a role, and to what degree. But the scale of that is, again, it's overwhelming. I mean, you said 10 megawatts. We're looking. I think National Grid did a study recently just on one circuit, but we're looking at whether it's along interstate corridors. Locations that would have, the potential instantaneous demand of 30, 50, 60 megawatts for heavily trafficked areas if all trucks are electrified. That's a massive undertaking. Can you build a transmission to get there? That's not a distributed future in terms of the needs along those interstates. That's going to be just pure copper and getting high voltage transmission lines to serve those sites. We have interstates 85 and 95 that go right through both our Virginia and South Carolina territories. Truck traffic is enormous. And so it's a daunting task, but I think that planning, if the trucks come at scale, if the sales pick up, I mean, it's the next wave of planning, I think.
Yeah, and I think for me, there's one concept which I think it's pretty old, but I think it's pretty relevant in these days, which is this customer-driven investments in a proactive way. One of the biggest struggles as an industry I think we face is that we tend to be a really reactionary-driven industry where there's a problem, go and invest and solve that problem. But that's going to be a problem for people that are building EVs. Like we have Amazon, for example, which is looking to build a bunch of charging depots, right, where they're going to have a bunch of trucks. And if you wait for them to kind of build a thing, you're going to get in their way. There's no doubt about it, right? Because it's going to take us time to go and build a new transmission line or distribution line and then ultimately serve them. So we need to start looking at kind of what is it going to happen, right? Like Paul talked about economic development. Like what are those areas that are going to have this growth? And let's proactively invest. And we're starting to see some level of success with being proactive about making those investments because that's going to be necessary. I think the second piece, which you talked about, Mark, is do we really need to connect everything to the distribution system, right? There's certain places where we're actually closer to the transmission system, and there's a lot of places where you're better off just connecting to transmission and skipping distribution all along, especially for large installations where, like you think about, like, for example, like Boston to Albany. not a lot of density in those two areas, between those two areas. There's not a lot of big distribution feeders, but there's a lot of transmission between the two of them. So can you plug it directly on transmission? Probably a possibility, right? And we have someone from Grid who used to come from the transmission group, so you can ask him all the questions. We might be here, but that's the way we're thinking about it. It's like, how do you tie to transmission where it makes sense, and how do you do proactive investments where you know that there's going to be the need?
All right, thank you. Anyone have anything else? No? Okay. We have time for one more question. Oh my gosh. Okay. All right, well then we'll just end it on final thoughts from the panelists. Mike, would you like to help us round it out?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think the opportunity is huge here, and you know, as I've been saying, we're like deep into the weeds of how to do this, and I think the knowledge is there now. I mean, we know what can be done, we know how to do it, and we got to get on with it.
Thank you. Pat?
Bill Gates wrote a book a number of years ago called The Road Ahead. And I love one of the quotes from that book. He says, we always overestimate the amount of change that will occur in the next 2 years, and we underestimate the change that will occur in the next 10. So don't be lulled into inaction.
Great, thank you. Mark?
I'm not sure I can top that, but I say something similar to that myself sometimes, but I just think it's the future is just going to be dramatic changes. And I don't think we know what all those will be. That's a cliche, but there really will be. There will be solutions that come out in 5 to 10 years that we're not even thinking about today, and there has to be. But I think to me, what's rewarding is that it's all happening for a better world, we hope, and to help us meet our targets. And let's just hope we get there, because I think we need to.
Thank you so much. Carlos?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the biggest thing, and I'll try to leave us on an uplift note. You know, we've talked a lot about distribution, grid edge intelligence, and all those fancy terms. We're actually doing it. So I'm just really, really happy that we passed the point of like talking about it, and we're actually doing it as an organization, and that's exciting. Like, we're gonna make a bunch of mistakes between now and then, but we're doing it, and that is hopeful. That gives me the hope that we're on the right track. And even if we have to twist and turn, we're now doing and not talking. So we'll leave it to that.
Excellent. Before we give them a round of applause, because they totally deserve it, I just want to let you know that lunch is over at 1:45. We have fabulous breakout sessions that you need to be prompt for, because we have fabulous panelists. We're going to be saying a whole bunch of really cool things. I promise. With that, let's give them a round of applause and go get some lunch.